Today on 7th Circle Gaming, we analyze another game from Paradox Game Studios, the alleged masters of grand strategy, Stellaris. And we'll get started here like we usually do with the full disclosure, and as we usually say, you are fully cordially invited to pause the video now and read through all of these at your leisure, or if you prefer not to, don't pause the video and let's move on to the interesting stuff in the screenshots. Now, the first one that we've got to share with you is the rules of the world, for want of a better phrase, setup mode, where the player is able to define the list of variables for the game world that will impact difficulty in some way. In addition to that, on the right-hand side of the screen is a checklist of various DLC that the player has installed at that time. And moving on, let's now show you what the game world is going to look like at the 30,000 foot view, and obviously that's a theoretical 30,000 foot view. Not much more to say about this, other than it is a theoretical view of what space might look like if we were able to look at space from 30,000 feet above it. Which means our next screenshot that we're going to share with you is the solar system view. At this point, we're also going to share with you a little bit about the user interface. The primary items of interest in the user interface are on the top of the screen. That's the economic and social indicators. Also, the notifications bar can be found there. That's those lovely little dangling icons with the drama masks and the crosshairs up there. And then on the left hand side is the quick access menu, where players can find access to various items like diplomacy, ship designer, expansion planner, and other things that are going to come into effect as players progress through the game. One final note on this screenshot is the advisor on the right hand side of the screen. Now, Stellaris does not have, as far as we've been able to determine, a tutorial mode. The advisor is going to take the place of that. So then, with that, let's move on to our next screenshot, and here is the screenshot that we'd like to use to illustrate the level of complexity on offer in Stellaris. What we're looking at, to be more precise, is the planet interface. And in this dialog box, almost every item is interactable in some way. Whether it be adding another region or developing another region on the planet, or building a new building, or simply hovering over an item to get the statistics that are attached to that. Obviously, there's a lot to manage, and this screen is only one of the possible management icon or dialog boxes, but this one is really, from all of our time with the game and the evaluation, the one that illustrates the most complexity in the least amount of time. And so then, moving on, let's come to Chapter 1, Immersion. And here, Stellaris has earned a 7 out of 15. The presentation is going to be getting invested into the game. It's a top-down, vaguely realistic representation of space. Obviously, at the present time, the year 2022, the human species has not expanded beyond the planet Earth in any meaningful way, or the galaxy, and there were no extraterrestrials that have been encountered, so the relatability of the game is going to be somewhat lower because of that. Well, getting off of that point, now let's move on to statistics focus, which is another thing that Stellaris is going to be using to get players invested into the game world. And here there are plenty of statistics to examine, analyze, and attempt to optimize. We're also going to say that Stellaris is using player agency to get players invested into the game world. And there are several factions to choose from. DLC exists to add additional factions. However, going back to our original point, the player's choices are going to shape the development not only of their particular faction, but of the universe as a whole, as the AI factions react to their decisions. In addition to that, players have the ability to influence the design of their faction's ships and rename planets as they desire. Now, Stellaris is going to be using challenge to get players invested into the game world as well, and this is going to be taking the form largely of management, sort of similar to a game like SimCity. Only they're managing planets, not cities or buildings. But that aside, let's move on to Chapter 2 and discuss difficulty. And on this point, Stellaris has earned a 5 out of 15. It does have a fairly complicated user interface, as we've tried to illustrate already. A fair amount in the game is learned by doing or learned by exploring. Certainly that's been our experience of the game. Other players may not find that to be so much, especially if they consult user guides or anything like that. The in-game advisor seems largely to take the place of the tutorial in other games, giving the player a fair amount of freedom to explore. As we try to illustrate as well, with that first screenshot, there are many options to fine-tune the difficulty to what the player is interested in at that particular moment, or how much time they have to commit to the game. On that screen, there are some options that are more obvious in how they're going to impact difficulty and need no explanation. Others are not really going to impact difficulty in any meaningful way, but are going to be more aesthetically impactful, sort of like selecting whether the galaxy is going to be an elliptical, spherical, or spiral. Really no significant impact apart from the aesthetic or from the presentation. The final point that we want to make on difficulty is that few, if any, of the commands are difficult to learn. Stellaris can be played almost completely with a mouse. Keyboard is almost unnecessary apart from the obvious renaming of things. And moving right along, let's talk about lasting appeal. And this is really one of those high points of Stellaris. And appropriately enough, the game has earned an 8 out of 15. Stellaris does have a fair amount of mod support available, both through the Steam Workshop and third-party sources. Almost any science fiction franchise that the player cares to name has either ships available, planets, faction characteristics, or a total conversion available for it. And there are significant DLC available. They seem to come in two branches. These are, of course, a species pack and story content packs. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but for now, what we really want to just get the point across is that there are two branches of DLC available. Even without the DLC, there are several factions to choose from, with some substantial differences among them. We'll also add at this point that the game does seem to enjoy continued support from the developer, and it doesn't seem likely to end at any point. So, one final thing that we will add, at this point is that Stellaris, for all of its benefits, it does seem to require some self-immersion on the part of the player, especially players that were more interested in science fiction are going to find the game potentially more immersive. But we'll talk more about that a bit later. For now, let's move on and tabulate the overall score. Overall, Stellaris has earned a 6.66 out of 15. A large amount of what's gotten Stellaris that credit is mod support in the two branches of DLC that are of seemingly variable value intervals. Now, our next statement is going to be highly subjective, so grains of salt ready. Now, players that are perhaps interested in the core gameplay loop of Stellaris, but haven't necessarily identified with a faction, may find the species packs particularly valuable or some esteemable value. Players that are not interested at all in Stellaris' core gameplay loop are not going to have any reason to invest in any of those species packs or the story packs whatsoever, because they are not likely to change the player's impression of the game drastically. Players that have spent a significant amount of time with the game but are seeking to add some more complexity or more flavor to their game may find those story packs to be of some value. Now then, that all said, we will add that Stellaris could be described as easy to learn and difficult to master. It is not by any stretch of the imagination the cheapest in the Paradox game series. There are others that are available for lower cost. Players that are particularly interested in science fiction may find more appeal in Stellaris than players that are not. On the other hand, it could be said, and this is going to be somewhat subjective, the game is paced fairly well, and it does seem to embrace any amount of free time that the player has to devote to the game. So then, on that bombshell, that is all there is to say about Stellaris, and from everyone at 7th Circle Gaming, goodbye.